Hi, and welcome to ADAC Answers, an education podcast for all. I'm your host, Erin Black. ADAC specializes in providing to private school leaders and teachers customized professional development programs to assist their schools with meeting individual student learning needs and increasing overall student achievement. Led and staffed by passionate, committed professionals, ADAC prides itself on delivering to its clients and the students and families whom its clients serve precise solutions to their unique education challenges. ADAC stands for Accountability, Delivery, Access, and Community, 4 words we believe epitomize our work. We hope you enjoy today's episode and join us in listening to future episodes discussing all things education. Welcome back to another episode of ADAC Answers. I'm your host, Erin Black, and today we are going to be talking about empowering education, the Teach Florida story. And we have 2 guest speakers with us today, Ariella Hellman, ADAC Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy, and Danny Aqua, Executive Director of Teach Florida. Thank you both so much for being with us today. We appreciate you guys taking the time to share your expertise. We will just jump right into our conversation. If you guys could briefly introduce yourselves and give us a little bit of background, that would be great.
Great. So thank you so much, Erin. Thrilled to be here with you this morning. As Erin said, I'm Ariella Hellman, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy at ADAC. I actually started my journey practicing law, but pretty quickly shifted over to the nonprofit advocacy realm. And I spent 7 years working for the Jewish Federation and running a coalition of non-public schools, advocacy support for those schools, I should say. And we did a lot of that work in coalition with other private school partners, such as the Catholic schools and Christian schools across the state, and really found that they were incredible partners to our schools. And together, we really leaned into the federal programs work and achieved some real benefits for our students. And that's how I met the founder, one of the founders, Steve Perla, and we joined together to do this work on behalf of ADAC, and thrilled to be working now with Danny Aqua and Teach Florida to help their schools access federal program supports as well.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Ariella. I'm Danny Aqua, Executive Director of Teach Florida, and really excited to be on today. We've had a great partnership with ADAC and Ariella and their team in trying to help kids, because that's what we're about. I, like Ariella, am a recovering attorney. I practiced law for a quick year and realized that really I want to do something more meaningful. So I switched and I was an assistant teacher, and I went back for my master's in education, and I taught in schools for 3 years, primarily in Jewish day schools. But one of the things I noticed was that there was an incredible burden on parents from a financial standpoint to afford a Jewish education and the best education for their kid. And that translated also some challenges for the schools being able to offer a quality educational product. And so I really discovered school choice and the opportunity for every child to receive funding for their education and really improve the quality of every part of our school system, both private, homeschool, and public school. And that's what I've been advocating for with Teach Florida for the last couple of years. So I'm now the Executive Director of Teach Florida. So I discovered Teach Florida while I was teaching, which is an arm of the Orthodox Union, actually the largest kosher certification agency in the United States. And they recognize this challenge of affording a Jewish education. So they established Teach Florida to be an advocacy arm for non-public schools. And Teach Florida's mission is to make safe, quality, affordable Jewish education accessible to every child. So we have operations in any state with a sizable Jewish day school population, which currently includes New York, New Jersey, California, Maryland, and Florida, and Pennsylvania, and are constantly looking to expand as our experience and knowledge grow in terms of how to be successful in the advocacy space.
Wonderful. Can you speak to the main goals and initiatives at Teach Florida?
At Teach Florida, we're looking to make policy changes that will benefit children, primarily in the non-public school space, but always thinking about the educational system as a whole, making sure that there are no negative impacts on the public school space as well, and really to benefit the quality of non-public school education and the accessibility through creating affordable policies. And we also have an arm that helps what we call government maximization, which is taking the policies that are in place, whether they be state or federal, and working on how to make those accessible to parents and schools. And we've worked a lot at the state level. Our primary work's from the state level because 90% of education funding comes from the state. But that 10% silo is really important as well from the federal government. And that's why we had to bring in experts from ADAC to really help us understand what's the history of ESSA and IDEA and all these programs that can support kids who really have additional challenges and needs in the classroom?
Yeah, I would say, Aaron, that some of the difficulties are really just that there hasn't been a lot of education around the equitable services requirements in IDEA. And when I say the equitable services requirements, what I mean by that is that school districts are required to share a portion of the federal grant that they get through IDEA for special education services for their students with the private school students who are going to school in their district who need special education related services. And I think that there has been maybe a misconception, if you will, that these funds are not really significant enough to address the needs of private school students. And therefore, perhaps the private school community has not been particularly attuned to these funds. And by the same token, I would say on the public school side, especially due to COVID, the job of being a special education director at a school district, at a public school district, is just an enormous task. And there are just a myriad of responsibilities that are constantly pulling at you. And I think it's really hard to focus on the needs of non-public schools who want to participate in these grants, especially if those non-public schools are not very vocal about that participation. So we see this take many different forms. In some districts, the district leader, the special ed director, sends out a letter to non-public schools and says, would you like to come to our consultation meeting for IDEA? But the non-public schools don't really understand the program or the opportunity under that program. So they don't respond to the letter. They say, this is public school. It's got nothing to do with me. And sometimes they just toss the letter in the wastebasket. And other times they go to the meeting, but they don't really understand the opportunity that's being offered. And by the same token, I'd say that there hasn't been a lot of education for district leaders on this program. And the requirements are incredibly complex and nuanced. And it is therefore sometimes really hard for the private schools and the district leaders to partner on this program and to have meaningful consultation, which is required under the law, when there's not a lot of understanding and education on both sides. What we do at ADAC is really try to address that on both ends, working with the non-public school leaders, like the great leaders at Teach Florida that have been really active and engaged in this, but also working with the district leaders to bring them along and to work with the state education department to increase education and to make sure that private school leaders and districts have the information they need to fully be able to access and implement these programs.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I'll add that I think the challenges that Jewish K school leaders, families face are the same as the challenges of any non-public school, which is really just the way the program is administered and the complexity of the program, because the money does not go to the private schools. It goes to the school districts. And so someone else is controlling your money, in a sense, your decision making. If you've ever had to make decisions or access money through anybody else in any context, in any marketplace, it's really challenging. And so trying to simplify things and create partnerships with the school districts to make things work and flow, that the money is actually accessible and really the services that the children need are accessible, is our primary goal. It's about simplifying these complex programs.
During the past school year, has any progress been made with addressing IDEA related matters?
Yeah, I'm really happy to share that we've had a number of very successful meetings with the Vice Chancellor at the Florida Department of Education, Vice Chancellor Ani and her team, and they have been very accessible and expressed a real willingness to work with us to resolve the issues that Teach Florida has uncovered on the ground. I would say two things that have come out of this right away is that one of the issues we were finding was that it was really hard for students in Jewish day schools and other private schools throughout the state of Florida to get an evaluation from the district, which they're entitled to under the law. And part of the problem was that the district was saying you need to go through an RTI process, a response to intervention process, in order to ask for this evaluation. And the federal government, in their guidance that they published in February 2022, was very clear that RTI does not apply to students attending private schools that are parentally placed in those schools. And so one of the first things that the Florida Department of Education has done that we're very grateful for is to publish a memo making that very clear to all the districts that RTI is not required for students in non-public schools. We've also partnered with them very significantly on a new technical assistance paper regarding the obligations of districts to students that are parentally placed in private schools. And I would say the last time that this guidance has been updated was in 2015. And of course, thanks to the great work of Teach Florida and their coalition partners, there have been a lot of changes in the education landscape in Florida. And these federal programs really don't operate in a vacuum. They operate in the context of state laws and state programs and state policies. And so there have been a lot of changes, and this document really does need to be updated and revised given all of those changes and major shifts in the landscape in Florida. So we're very pleased that the department will be updating that guidance. We anticipate that they'll be able to release that guidance in the fall. And the ADAC team partnered very closely with the department to revise that guidance.
That's great. Wonderful work. And I'm excited to see what happens next. Danny, did you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Of course. No, we've made significant progress also, I'd say, with educating our parents in schools, because so much of it is people understanding what their rights are. And so practically speaking, if you want to have your child evaluated, which is a child-fied component and very important part of IDEA, you request that evaluation from the district, and within 30 days, they're supposed to have you sign a consent to evaluate form. And then within 60 days of that, they're supposed to have you complete the evaluation. And so you really have this 90-day timeline here in Florida where your child should be evaluated. Now, that's practically hasn't been happening. And those timelines are oftentimes greater than a year, can approach 2 years or more, or never even happen. And that's a reality that we've been faced with for a long time. We appreciate ADACs coming in and educating both our staff at Teach Florida and our schools and our parents on what their rights are. And it doesn't mean that we've been able to enforce it properly yet, in part because of the education we're doing at the district level and the state level in terms of how these programs are supposed to run. But certainly I consider it major progress.
Parent advocacy is huge, and especially just navigating the system when you're lost, you're not quite sure what to do. If you don't have any background in education or with law, it could be very difficult to understand.
It's a systemic problem of 100%. Too many people with responsibilities that are not clearly defined. And so one person is pushing the paper to someone else who has to push it to someone else who's held up by this requirement. And oftentimes it's just about creating a system that has a workflow that will allow the process to come to fruition within those 90 days.
Ariella, you mentioned accessing title programs. Can you briefly describe what the title programs are?
Absolutely. So these are programs that fall under the Every Student Succeeds Act. And that law was last reauthorized in 2015. There are 4 title programs that I think I just want to focus on for the purposes of private school students. And that is the Title I program, Title III, and Title IV. And all of these programs provide equitable services. So again, a federal grant that goes from the federal government to the state and then to the districts according to a very specific formula. And then those funds have to be shared equitably with students or teachers attending that are in private schools. These programs are meant to provide an additional layer of supplemental support to students in private schools. So in other words, it's not meant to supplant the supports or the teaching that the private school is already offering, but they're meant to provide an added layer of support for students that may need them. For example, the Title I program is a program to close academic achievement gaps for students from low-income families. And that's probably the largest of all the title programs and the one that's often most impactful for our schools. But these programs are very significant in providing additional resources for the schools to really be able to meet the needs of their students.
I'll give my understanding, not being the expert in the field, of how these programs work. So at IDEA, we spoke about briefly, is for services for children with disabilities. And that's the child find process, making sure you can get an evaluation through the district, and then the services for which you're eligible. And the title programs are from a different federal law. And really Title I, II, III, and IV are the main ones. So Title I is generally to close those achievement gaps for children from low-income families. Title II is professional development. Title III is English as a second language. And Title IV is a little more flexible. Ariella probably knows the details. I think about it as like the most flexible usage for even things like certain technologies or desks or things that people need in the classroom. And so once you have that kind of umbrella understanding, and then you can kind of get into the weeds of how you can actually access those programs.
How do non-public school leaders access title programs?
So it's the same process that we described for IDEA, and the main way that private school, that I would say district leaders collaborate with non-public schools regarding how to spend the funds that they are holding, let's say for the benefit of the private school students, is through the consultation process, right? So consultation are these meetings where we get together and we have conversations, really meaningful dialogue about the best way to use the funds given the needs of the students in the school. And it's through those meetings that all parties have an opportunity to express their point of view and to make decisions regarding how you impact those programs, how you use those funds.
Great. Has there been any progress assisting Jewish day school leaders with accessing services funded by the title programs?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I'm really proud of in terms of the work that we've done with Teach Florida. So the first is going to sound pretty basic, but I actually think it was a big breakthrough. In Orlando, we were able to work with the schools to be able to use their title funds to support professional development that was really targeted towards the needs of their particular school and culturally appropriate for Jewish day schools. So in a lot of LEAs and a lot of school districts, they have very specific vendors that they want to work with. And sometimes those vendors may or may not be offering options that are uniquely tailored to meet the needs of the particular school that the school is excited about, that wants to work on. And when there's that excitement and that passion, often the professional development is received differently and can impact students differently. In this particular LEA, we were able to have a conversation about why a particular vendor was offering a professional coaching service that fell in line completely with the parameters of the Title II program and was fully allowable under the terms of that program. And the district was then able to enter into a contract with that provider to enable the schools to access the professional development that they really needed. I would say that we are working on the same type of issue in Broward County, and we almost got this right last year, but there was a last minute snafu. And so we could not use a vendor that the schools felt comfortable with at that time. And so therefore the district was willing to roll over those funds so that we had a little more time to explore vendors for this year. And we've had some very promising conversations with vendors that will really work with schools to find providers that meet their unique needs and that they're really excited to work with. So we're very excited about that for next year. And I would say all these district leaders have been very collaborative and really great partners to us and really want to do the right thing. And so we're just excited to work with them to make this happen. I would say we're still working through Title I and Title IV now. Those are still areas that we need to work on. I would say just one other point that I think will really help and really speaks to Teach Florida's commitment and leadership on this program is that Teach Florida, I understand, has hired someone to work with all the schools to gather all the necessary paperwork and to connect all the dots, if you will. So these programs have a lot of red tape and there are a lot of bureaucratic hurdles. And when you're a busy principal with lots of kids that, need your attention in lots of situations that demand your time, it's hard to be able to dedicate the time and the energy to completing all the paperwork that the districts legitimately need our schools to complete. And I think Teach Florida has done a great job in saying, what are the hurdles? What are the things that are getting in our way here? And how can we systematically address those barriers? And Malka Conat Rhodes, who's a fantastic advocate for the schools, is also going to be the point person to represent the schools in consultation, because Malka's really worked hard over the course of the year to develop a mastery of the title programs. And with her knowledge and expertise, she is going to be she already is, but she's going to continue to be a fantastic advocate for all the schools. Whereas it's really hard for the schools to develop that level of mastery and to be able to come into those meetings with a defined, cohesive ask with the numbers behind it. So having one person in that role, I really do think will move the needle in a positive way.
When I think about progress in terms of our Jewish day schools and these federal programs, I think about really this intentional decision that we made at Teach Florida to staff up to provide what I call administrative support. Our schools focus on educating children. They're not focused on the legalities of government bureaucracy. And if we can reduce that administrative burden for our schools to be able to access these services so it can benefit the children in the classroom, it will do just so much for them in terms of freeing up their time to focus on what they need to focus on, which is educating our children. And I think that really is why so many schools have struggled to access these programs in the past, because a lot of private schools, they're not operating at scale. They're small mom and pop type shops. Even if there are 600 kids, that pales in comparison to the size of our public school districts here in South Florida. Each of our districts are hundreds of thousands of students each. And so they can afford to have an administrator that's focused on every different part of a government program. So we're trying here at Teach Florida to identify where we can best support the schools to really remove bottlenecks and increase access to the programs.
Pivoting from federal to state programs, you mentioned that Teach Florida advocates for private school choice. Can you give an overview of the non-public school choice program in Florida?
Yes, it's much easier this year because we now have universal school choice, meaning every single child from K to 12 can access a state scholarship that is the equivalent of their operating dollars they would have gotten in the public school. So practically speaking, somewhere around $8,000, depends on the grade level in the county. And it is in the form of an education savings account, an ESA. Now, many people are familiar with what a voucher is, because a voucher is money that a student could take to use to tuition and fees, but not everyone knows what an ESA is. And it's actually more important now because any school choice legislation around the country over the last couple of years is in the form of an ESA. An ESA is unique because it can be used toward tuition and fees, or it can be used to other qualified educational expenses, things like tutoring, like a virtual program, purchasing curriculum, a lot of different things that really can benefit the children's all-around education.
Great, thank you. How does the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program work?
Yeah, so there's multiple programs in Florida. And I think to simplify, because we talked about simplifying it, if you have a kindergarten through 12th grader and you decide not to send them to a public school, you can apply for a scholarship. And you can use that money either for tuition in a private school or for the first time this year for homeschooling your child. And I think we've seen just this massive growth in the homeschooling world in Florida. Now, what's important to remember is that this money can only be used towards qualified educational expenses. So I can't just use it towards any random school. It has to be a qualified school, or if it's homeschooling, a tutor who has a certification in that particular subject. So there are guardrails around the program, but we've seen just incredible options pop up for kids from schools out on the farms here in South Florida. One forest school that I know of, a soccer school that's doing like half day soccer. We have schools like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Acton Academy Network, that's basically run by the kids. It's a learner-driven environment, and the kids run the school and they learn from each other, and they have an incredible social contract for how they operate. And I think these funds have been able to increase the quality of the education in a lot of these alternative schools that were already in existence, but weren't able to access any state funding for their education. And I think practically speaking, you asked about the tax credit program. So originally this program started by corporations that would give tax credits to a large scholarship funding organization. Here, the biggest one in Florida is called Step Up for Students. And then they would give the money out to families who qualified for the scholarships. In 2018, they really reached the max of how much they could fundraise from corporations at about $700 million. It became much harder for them to raise more than that. And so Governor DeSantis in 2019, his first year in office, created the Family Empowerment Scholarship to alleviate the wait list because there wasn't enough tax credit funds, and actually funded directly from the state's general revenue. So the state now will have this year probably around 350,000 students using a scholarship, which is an incredible number. It's probably more than, I would say, 10 or 20% of the entire child population in many states in the US.
What kinds of impact do you anticipate the newly passed scholarship tax program will have on Jewish day schools and other Florida non-public schools and families?
We experience everything from the parent in tears who never thought they can afford a Jewish education. Just last month, someone said to me they're switching their 3 girls to a Jewish day school, which they never thought they'd be able to do. And in fact, in terms of looking at empirical data, Florida just surpassed California for the 3rd largest Jewish day school population. Wow. And I have no doubt that school choice is a part of that, because it's made Jewish education accessible to so many more families. And I think it's also what it's done for the schools themselves. There are serious inflationary pressures on a lot of our schools in terms of the teacher shortage, in terms of utility costs, property insurance costs, transportation costs. And our schools, because of the I'd say added revenue from families who they were subsidizing on scholarship before, but now we're going to get the state scholarship, they don't have to raise tuition as much as other schools around the country do in the nonprofit sector. And in fact, over the last decade, our Jewish schools here in Florida have increased tuition 28%. And the national average of private schools is 53%. So we've seen just an obvious impact on the Jewish day school sector here in Florida.
Can you share any success stories or examples of how the scholarship programs have made a difference in the lives of Jewish day school students and families, if you have one in particular you'd like to share?
There are so many stories, and we've had at every one of our events a different parent come and speak. So I can tell you that there's one parent that spoke at one of our breakfasts that has 4 children. And for them, they came from Canada, and there was no doubt for culture they were sending their child to a Jewish day school. The question is, what kind of sacrifices would they have to make to be able to send their kids to a Jewish day school? And they sacrificed everything. They did not go even to visit their family in Canada because of the cost of the flight. In terms of the food they would purchase, as opposed in the Sabbath, we have accustomed to eat meat. So instead of purchasing meat, they would purchase chicken, anything a little cheaper just to be able to send their kids. And I remember saying to them one time, like, wow, what a sacrifice you've made to send your kids. And they said, no, it's not a sacrifice. It's a privilege. And I think there's so many stories of families that were giving up so much, and it affects the family too. It affects the marriage. It affects the relationship when you're under significant financial pressure. And it's the reason that I think we've seen such an uptick in voter turnout on this unique particular issue in our community. It's so rare that a government program will so directly affect a voter. And I think school of choice is one of those examples of a program that so obviously affects every individual voter in the state that so many people will put that first in terms of their voting policy and voting agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that at the statement of it's a privilege, not a sacrifice. That is pretty incredible. Danny, could you give your advice for non-public school advocacy organizations in other states who are just getting off the ground right now and are dreaming of accessing the support that Teach Florida has achieved for their students? How would you guide them based on your current experience and your journey to this point?
The most important thing that we've seen in Florida's non-public school space is a strong coalition. And I want to give tremendous credit to Excel in Ed, which is Governor Bush's foundation that has put together bi-weekly calls of every stakeholder in the private school sector here in Florida for the last, as long as I can remember. And just the people that I've met on those calls, the discussions we've had around policy and the practical impacts of it, and also the ability to give feedback both to the Department of Education and to the scholarship funding organizations to make sure that we can simplify the program so we don't have the same challenges at the state level that we discussed at having at the federal level have been invaluable. And that's the thing that we have to build a little more, I'd say, in the federal programs, is just that sense of working with a broader coalition, because we're all experiencing the same challenges. And so there's power in numbers, and working together, building that coalition, I would certainly say is key.
What about the interplay between the state and federal programs in your state, and how these programs can reinforce one another and create added layers of benefits for students?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So I think that all of these programs, as we discussed earlier, operate within the context of state law and state policies. So, for example, the Florida Empowerment Scholarship for students with unique abilities, for students that have special needs, is for students who have been found eligible by our school district or have a diagnosis from a physician or a psychologist that's licensed under Florida law. And I think that one of the challenges in Florida is that some families can pay for a private evaluation, but other families may not have the means. And if they can instead go through the district process, that could be very helpful for them in taking advantage of the state scholarship program. So there's benefit both in terms of the federal program itself and the proportionate share dollars that are generated by students with disabilities under IDEA, but also there are ramifications in terms of the state scholarship program. And there are students who can just go to a doctor and get a doctor to diagnose them with their disability, but sometimes that 1 hour interaction with a student that a pediatrician has may not really be enough for a district to create a matrix score, or a matrix score that's high enough for the student to really get the support that they need under the Florida Empowerment Scholarship Program. And that's where it's really helpful if there is a free process that works. So we don't have families who are waiting 2 years, but families who can reach out to the district and, as they're entitled to under the law, say, hey, I'm really concerned about my child. I'd like an evaluation, and find a supportive and listening ear on the other side who doesn't say, first, you need to give us these 18 forms before we can even talk to you, or basically come up with different roadblocks that are in the way. And not because of the fault of any administrators, just because we have a system that needs some work to get a clearer workflow and a clearer process that can work for families. So the more that we fix that process, which is a federal process, it's a process that's required under federal law, the easier time I think parents will have in accessing the Florida Scholarship Program. And that may not be a pathway for every parent, but it's another pathway for parents to come into that program. I do think that there will be benefits. I also think that the needs of students in our schools right now are enormous as we recover from the pandemic and we deal with all sorts of different issues that are leading to a very significant uptick in mental health issues for students across the country. And I think that we're going to need all the resources that we can get to really support students at this moment. There are state programs that cover certain costs and federal programs that cover all costs. But this is all a pie that's expanding, and students are the beneficiaries of that expanding pie. So I think it's great that Teach Florida is investing in both the state and the federal programs.
I completely agree. Danny, do you have anything to add?
I certainly do. And I feel very passionately about this issue. So the state funding and the state scholarship is that basic number that public schools get for each child. But as we know, not every child costs the same to educate. I was a teacher, Erin, you were a teacher, you had kids in your class that are very easy and they sit and they do their work, and kids that need a lot more time and support. And schools generally work on a rule of averages. Those students average each other out in the classroom, and that's how schools work. The problem is if you only give that basic level of funding to every child, then private schools will only be able to support the kids that are easy to educate. And then you're creating this cycle of the kids that the private schools can't support having to go to public school. And the public schools say, we need more funding now because we have all these challenging kids. But the reality is, if we can make the system work where the children get their state funding and then all those supplemental supports that they're supposed to be getting from federal law in the private schools, we'll have less of that issue of the private schools not being able to service these children. So I think they're critical that these programs work together.
Thank you for that. Do you guys have any final thoughts or anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I guess I would just share, Erin, that from the perspective of a private school leader who has tapped into these federal funds, and as someone who's worked with private school leaders across the country to start to tap into these funds, I think that the level of funding that we are collectively still leaving on the table in terms of these federal funds is enormous. And these programs take some time to learn. Yes, there are going to be some bureaucratic hurdles and some pain points along the way. But I have seen in many states that once you do the work of really getting to the bottom, the root causes of where the challenges are, and you systematically knock down those hurdles, and equally as important, build really strong relationships with state leaders and district leaders, the benefit to your students is going to be enormous. There is real money on the table that can benefit students in real and impactful and tangible ways. And I really encourage everyone to learn more and to try to just jump in and access these funds for your kids.
Great. Thank you so much, Ariella.
And I'll close with this. If there are any legislators listening to this, any school district staff listening to this, or any private school staff listening to this, I think the first question you should ask yourself is, how well do I understand ESSA and IDEA and these title programs? How well do I even understand my own state funding? And how can we make things better if we don't really understand it? What can we do to collaborate and communicate more effectively with stakeholders that have other interests and other positions? And our private school leaders too, like, you have to also get your mind into the district staff and understand how challenging it might be for some of them, because communicating and collaborating is both ways. It's understanding what are your challenges, what are their challenges, and how do we find that common ground to make progress. And so I think that's the key. I wish more people could educate themselves the way that ADAC has helped educate us on the federal programs. We at Teach Florida are just excited and eager to educate anyone we can on how Florida education funding works and the scholarship programs work, and even the public school funding works, because it impacts every kid. That's what I would say everyone should ask themselves, and in order to be able to make progress.
Thank you both so much for your time and your expertise today. Thank you for your commitment and your sacrifice to serve these students, families, and communities. Thank you so much. To everyone at home, if you have any follow-up questions you would like to see addressed in a future episode, or if you want to share your thoughts on today's topic, then please submit them to us on social media using the hashtag ADAC Answers. That's right, ADAC, and the word answers to let us know. If you would like to hear future ADAC Answers episodes, then please follow, like, and subscribe. And if you're interested in finding out more about our company and the services we offer, please visit us on our website at www.theadac.com. That is THEADAC.com. Thank you so much for listening to our episode today, and we look forward to you tuning in to our next episode. Again, thank you to all of our listeners from the ADAC team. We'll see you next time.